Hello, my name is Jessica Edmonds. I am a fourth year environmental science major with a specialization in ecosystem restoration. And in this, I will be talking about how climate change impacts bee populations. So, there are two ways that climate change impacts bees, and that is directly through the direct killing of bees and brood, and indirectly through things like changing blooming times, and I will talk about that more on the next slide. So, one way that climate change directly impacts bees is killing the adult bee population during random cold spells in the spring. So, in this case, the bees only stock up enough food to survive the winter. And so when spring comes around, they can just leave the colony, forage for food, come back with and restock their food supplies. But if a random cold spell were to strike, this would force the foragers to return to the colony and basically only survive off the food that they have left over from winter, which is generally not enough to support the bee colony, especially if it is an extended cold spell, which are common, as we know, based on the weather here in Ohio. That happens. And in this case, the bees can starve to death because the food left over from winter just isn't enough to support them. And that's what's happening to the bees in this picture here. They're trying to get that last little bit of honey out of the bottom of the cell and died in the process. Another direct impact of climate change on bees is killing the brood during, again, cold spells. This happens because in order to keep the brood alive and maintain the brood, the colony needs to maintain an internal temperature of about 93 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it is super cold outside in the spring, this is hard to do. And what happens is the outermost brood dies because they begin concentrating more on the center, where more of the brood is, and the death will just keep moving inward and inward and inward until most, if not all, of the brood is entirely wiped out just because they're trying to keep what they can alive. And this can easily wipe out an entire hive by the time spring actually rolls around. So those are the direct impacts of climate change on bees, and I will now look at the indirect impacts. So as I said before, climate change can also have indirect impacts on bee populations. And this would be through things like flowers blooming earlier than they normally do because of the warming climate. I specifically looked at bumblebee populations in Texas, and in this case, the bees and the flowers had evolved together, and the bees would like emerge at the same time that the flowers bloom, and everything was great, and then the flowers started blooming earlier, and the bees would miss the peak bloom and would die because of a lack of food. And this can have horrible impacts on the colony. As you can imagine, bees would starve, there wouldn't be enough food to go around. So this is a massive problem in some places. Another reason that climate change is real bad for the bees is because it can restrict places that the bees can live. And again, I looked at bumblebees in the south, and here it is becoming too warm in their normal climate, so they want to move north. But in the north is only unfamiliar food sources. So they're kind of being, the paper I read said that they were kind of being like squeezed in a vice between an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar food sources and a place too hot for them to live. And it's just squeezing and squeezing. And if this continues, who's to say what happens to the bees, but it's not going to be good. Okay, and these are the indirect impacts of climate change on bee populations. This is not a problem that is exclusive to bees. If bee populations continue to drop, it will hurt us as well. A decrease in pollinator population will lead to an overall decrease in farm crop yields, especially on things like apples, blueberries, cherries, melons, broccoli, and especially almonds, who are just solely rely on bee pollination to thrive. And of course, this will result in an increase in fresh food prices, which will affect people who already can't afford to buy fresh food even more. So it'll just be this vicious cycle of bees dying, decreased yield, increased food prices, decrease in fresh food available for people who need fresh food. And as with most environmental issues nowadays, it is our fault. And the one way we can really just stop this altogether is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because as you can see, the trend in carbon dioxide emissions is rising to record heights, and that's one of the main causes of global warming. So if we were to use more renewables and decrease our reliance on fossil fuels, that is really the only true solution to stop climate change and stop climate change from affecting the bees. So that was my presentation. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.